The Galactic Confederation had been around for approximately 12,000 standard cycles, which was impressive considering most civilizations couldn't organize a decent potluck dinner without at least 3 diplomatic incidents. In that time, they'd mastered faster than light travel, solved the energy crisis 17 different ways, and developed technology so advanced that their coffee makers had better artificial intelligence than most pre-spaceflight civilizations. What they hadn't mastered, apparently, was common sense when it came to categorizing planets. See, the Confederation had this adorable little system for rating worlds based on how likely they were to kill you. Class 1 worlds were basically paradise gardens, where the most dangerous thing you'd encounter was perhaps a mildly judgmental butterfly. Class 5 worlds had some weather patterns that might require an umbrella. Class 9 worlds, on the other hand, were the kind of places where the planet itself seemed personally offended by your existence and was actively trying to correct that situation. Earth was a Class 9. The Confederation had stamped that rating on humanity's file with the kind of emphasis usually reserved for biohazard warnings and political manifestos. The planet featured gravity that would crush most species' bones into interesting new configurations, an atmosphere that contained oxygen at concentrations that were technically flammable, temperature swings that could freeze water solid or boil it within the same planetary rotation, and weather systems with enough energy to level entire cities. That wasn't even touching on the wildlife situation, which included everything from microscopic organisms that could kill you in fascinating ways to massive apex predators that could do it in much more straightforward ones. The beings that evolved on this delightful murder sphere were, unsurprisingly, built accordingly. Humans were dense, both physically and sometimes mentally, with skeletal structures reinforced by one of the heaviest gravity wells in known space. Their musculature was packed into relatively compact frames, their cardiovascular systems were overbuilt to the point of redundancy, and their pain tolerance was what other species might generously call clinically concerning. They healed from injuries that would retire other beings permanently. They could function on sleep deprivation that would cause hallucinations in most species, and they had this charming habit of doing something called exercise, which was essentially damaging their own bodies on purpose to make them stronger. Deathworld logic at its finest. The Confederation, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that integrating humans into their society would be a grand idea. Cultural exchange, they called it. Mutual understanding, building bridges between species. What they actually meant was that they'd grossly underestimated what humanity could bring to the table and now needed to save face politically. The Terran Protectorate had joined the Confederation 40 cycles ago, and most species were still adjusting to the reality that these compact, energetic primates from the scary planet were actually pretty reasonable, polite, even. They said please and thank you, they followed regulations, and they seemed genuinely interested in learning about other cultures. What the Confederation was slowly, painfully learning was that reasonable and polite did not mean harmless. It just meant that humans had developed social structures sophisticated enough to keep the murder world instincts on a very tight leash. Very tight. The key word being leash, which implied that yes, there was something being restrained, and no, you probably didn't want to see what happened if that leash ever broke. The Zenith Strategic Academy was considered one of the finest military institutions in Confederation space, which meant it was stuffed full of the children of important people learning how to be important themselves, while occasionally also learning actual military strategy. The campus sprawled across 3 interconnected space stations in neutral territory, housed approximately 15,000 cadets from over 200 species, and had enough brass on staff to build a small ship. It was also, for the past 15 cycles, home to the Confederation's first integrated training program with Terran cadets. That experiment had been going about as well as could be expected, which meant there had been incidents, nothing catastrophic, mind you. Just the usual complications that arose when you mix species that had evolved under wildly different circumstances. Like the time a human cadet had accidentally hospitalized 4 other students during a zero-gravity combat exercise because nobody had properly explained to her opponent that humans could, in fact, generate significant force without gravity to push against. Or the incident where a human had eaten what other species considered a Class 3 toxin for lunch, and then asked if there were seconds. Or the memorable occasion when a human had gone for a light jog on the station's outermost ring, where the rotational gravity was highest, and 3 Palaxian cadets had tried to join him, thinking it couldn't be that difficult. The medical bay had needed to treat severe muscular trauma, and one case of what the doctors termed catastrophic pride injury. Most cadets had learned, through these colorful examples, that Deathworlders operated under different rules. They gave the humans space, treated them with cautious respect, and generally avoided doing anything that might trigger a response from beings whose fight or flight reflexes had been calibrated by a planet that offered no safe middle ground. This was sensible. This was smart. This was the kind of basic survival instinct that had allowed their species to reach the stars. Not everyone, however, had gotten the memo. Krevix Valthorin was a Vexorian, which meant he was tall, imposing, and had skin that looked like someone had crossbred a crystal formation with an attitude problem. Vexorians hailed from a high-gravity world themselves, though not nearly as extreme as Earth, and their natural dermal plating made them significantly more durable than most spacefaring species. They were strong by galactic standards, proud by any standards, and Krevix was a particularly concentrated example of both traits. He was also the son of Ambassador Valthorin, which meant he'd grown up with a kind of immunity to consequences that turned promising young people into insufferable problems. At the academy, he'd gathered a small cluster of similarly inclined cadets around him, species whose main qualification for inclusion was their willingness to laugh at his jokes and ignore his increasingly problematic behavior. He'd been written up 17 times for various infractions, ranging from conduct unbecoming to creating hostile environment, but somehow the paperwork never quite resulted in actual punishment. His father's position saw to that. Krevix had opinions about humans. Loud ones. He found it personally offensive that these little primates from their oversized gravity, were being treated as equals to species that had been spacefaring for millennia. They were short, most of them barely reaching his shoulder. They were soft-looking, without natural armor or weapons. They tired easily, needing to sleep for a full third of every cycle. They were fragile little things that had simply gotten lucky with their planet's gravity, and he was determined to prove it. For 6 weeks, he'd been making one particular human cadet's life progressively more difficult. Started small, as these things do. Comments in passing. Strategic shoulder checks in corridors. Making sure she was always last to receive equipment during training. Nothing technically against regulations, just the kind of low-level harassment that people like Krevix had perfected into an art form. The human in question was named Rico Chen, though she preferred just Chen. She was compact even by human standards, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with the kind of efficient build that came from growing up in Earth's higher-than-average gravity zones. Her file said she was from someplace called Singapore, which apparently was a city-state on an island that sat basically on top of the equator, which meant she'd evolved in heat and humidity that would constitute a war crime on most civilized worlds. She was 24 standard years old, which was young even by human reckoning, and she'd scored in the 97th percentile on her combat certifications. That last detail should have been relevant to Krevix's decision-making process. It was not. Chen had a reputation among the other cadets for being quiet. Not shy, just economical with words. She did her work, she followed protocols, and she had this unnerving habit of staying absolutely calm in situations where other beings would be showing stress. Some of the other humans had tried to explain to curious alien classmates that this wasn't unusual, that plenty of humans were just naturally low-key. But there was something about the way Chen carried herself that suggested the calm wasn't just personality. It was choice. Active choice. The kind of choice you made when the alternative was less pleasant for everyone involved. Other cadets had picked up on this through that wonderful survival instinct that kept species alive. They gave Chen space, not out of fear, exactly, but out of that same vague caution you'd apply to any sophisticated piece of machinery that you didn't fully understand. The humans knew what was going on, obviously. The human cadets had taken to eating lunch together, partially for camaraderie and partially because it was easier than explaining to concerned alien friends that no, Chen wasn't dangerous. She was just from Earth, which was a distinction that made perfect sense to humans, and no sense whatsoever to anyone else. Krevix had noticed the space other cadets gave her. He'd interpreted this as fear, which was his first mistake. He decided that this meant she was weak and hiding it, which was his second mistake. His third mistake was deciding to prove his theory in the most public way possible. The main cafeteria at Zenith Academy was an architectural marvel, a vast space with adjustable gravity zones and atmospheric controls to accommodate dozens of species simultaneously. Meal periods were carefully staggered to avoid overcrowding, but there was always overlap, which meant the space was usually occupied by several hundred cadets at any given time. It was brightly lit, efficiently organized, and had the kind of ambient noise level that suggested civilization and order. It was also about to become very, very quiet. Chen had finished her third training block of the day, which had involved what humans called light calisthenics, and what several other species had described as watching a Deathworlder voluntarily destroy her own muscle tissue. She'd hit the showers, changed into fresh duty uniform, and headed to the cafeteria with the kind of singular focus that all humans got when they'd burned a few thousand calories and needed to reload. She'd made it through the line without incident, loaded her tray with enough protein to concern several nutritionists, and was heading toward the human section of the dining area when Krevix decided that today was the day he'd make his point. He stepped directly into her path. Not accidentally, not coincidentally. Deliberately, with his full 2-meter height positioned to maximum intimidation effect, his crystalline features arranged into what he probably thought was a dominating expression. His little crew flanked him at a safe distance, ready to laugh on cue. Chen stopped walking, looked up at him. Her expression didn't change. Didn't show annoyance, didn't show concern, didn't show anything at all. Just that same calm assessment that predators do when they're calculating whether something is food, threat, or neither. Move, she said, not aggressively. Stating a fact. This is what needs to happen next. Make me, Deathworlder, Krevix replied, because apparently he'd watched too many bad dramas and thought this was how dominance worked. Chen glanced to her left. Open path. She stepped that direction. Krevix mirrored her, blocking again. She went right, he followed. They did this dance one more time before Chen just stopped, standing there with her tray, waiting. What's wrong? Krevix asked, pitching his voice loud enough to carry. Several nearby tables were already going quiet, attention shifting their way. Too scared to even try pushing past. Is the fierce human finally showing what she really is? All reputation, no substance. Chen's jaw tightened slightly. First sign of actual emotion. I'm asking you once more. Move. Or what? Or what? Krevix took a step closer, using his height advantage, leaning down into her space. You'll file a complaint? Run to the administration? That's all your kind can do, isn't it? Hide behind rules, because you know you're not actually. That's when he made his final, catastrophic mistake. He reached out and shoved her backward. Not hard by his standards, just enough to make her stumble, to emphasize his point, to publicly demonstrate that these humans were all bark and no bite. His hand made contact with her shoulder, basic physics applied, force transferred. Chen shifted backward about 6 inches, her boots scraping slightly on the deck plating, tray tilting but not spilling because her grip adjusted automatically. Then she set the tray down, carefully, on the nearest table, took one breath in, let it out. Okay, she said quietly. Krevix was still smiling when her fist hit his face. See, here's the thing about humans that the Confederation was still learning. When you evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill you, your body developed very efficient methods of dealing with threats. Humans were persistence predators, sure. They could chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, but they were also ambush predators when needed, could generate significant force very quickly, and had skeletal structures that were essentially overbuilt calcium frameworks wrapped in meat armor. Chen was 122 pounds of Deathworld engineering, every ounce of which had been forged under 1.2 Gs of gravity in equatorial heat. She'd been training in combat systems since she was 12 years old, which meant half her life. Her punch wasn't wild or emotional. It was technical, mechanical, the kind of thing you could break down into components: hip rotation, weight transfer, shoulder engagement, arm extension, all happening in sequence so fast it looked simultaneous. Her fist traveled approximately 15 inches. It accelerated to roughly 25 miles per hour, which doesn't sound that impressive until you remember that it was accelerating mass behind it that had been conditioned by Earth's gravity. The impact force was somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 pounds, concentrated on about 2 square inches of surface area. Krevix's facial plating, which had evolved to handle the casual violence of his homeworld's environment, was rated to withstand impacts up to about 250 pounds of force. The sound was remarkable. Not a crack, not a crunch, more like the noise you'd get if you dropped a crystal glass into a garbage disposal. Wet and brittle at the same time. Several cadets later reported that the sound alone had made their stomachs turn. Krevix's head snapped back, his whole body following the momentum, feet actually leaving the deck for a moment. The cafeteria's ambient noise cut out like someone had hit a mute button. Krevix landed on his back, the impact echoing, and did not get back up, did not move. Just lay there, while the biological equivalent of a crystal structure's stress fracture propagated across the entire front of his skull. Chen looked down at him, shook her hand once, then picked her tray back up and continued walking toward her table. The next 30 seconds were complete chaos. Cadets were scrambling back, some species making distress calls in their native languages, others just staring in shocked silence. The cafeteria's medical monitoring systems, which tracked for any signs of significant injury, immediately lit up with alerts. Emergency response team was auto-dispatched. 3 security officers arrived at a run, expecting to find a brawl, and instead found Chen sitting at the human table, calmly eating her lunch, while Krevix's friends tried to figure out if they should help him or maintain a safe distance from the human. One of the security officers, a Palaxian with 40 cycles of experience, took one look at the scene, looked at Chen, then pulled up the security footage on his wrist display. The medical team arrived 15 seconds later. 2 doctors, 4 medical technicians, a portable scanner array, and a stretcher. They swarmed Krevix, who was starting to make sounds now, low groaning noises that suggested consciousness returning and immediately regretting it. The senior doctor, a Quellian named Dr. Virex, who had seen basically everything in 30 cycles of emergency medicine, ran the scanner over Krevix's face and went very, very still. "We need surgery," she said quietly. "Now, full reconstruction suite." They loaded Krevix onto the stretcher with the kind of care usually reserved for unstable explosives. One of the technicians asked what happened. Dr. Virex just pointed at Chen, who was approximately 20 feet away working on what looked like her third portion of protein. "A human punched him." "That's impossible. She's barely half his size." Dr. Virex pulled up the medical scanner data, showed him the fracture pattern spreading across Krevix's facial structure like a spider web. "Explain that then." The technician looked at the data, looked at Chen, back to the data. Oh no. Oh yes. They got Krevix out of there quickly, rushing him to medical bay, while every cadet in the cafeteria tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The security officer who'd pulled the footage was already uploading it to Central System, flagging it for immediate administrative review. His partner was approaching Chen's table, moving carefully, hands visible. "Cadet Chen?" She looked up, mouth full of something that might have been synthetic beef. Swallowed. "Yes? We need you to come with us. Just administrative protocols. Need to get your statement." "Am I under arrest?" "No. But we do need to document the incident." Chen nodded, stood up, grabbed one more protein bar from her tray for the road. "Understood." As she walked past, escorted by security, several hundred cadets watched in complete silence. One of the human cadets at her table pulled out his comm unit and started typing. Within 60 seconds, every human at the academy knew what had happened. Within 5 minutes, it had spread to the human ships in nearby systems. Within an hour, it would be on Earth itself, spreading through military channels with the kind of speed that suggested everyone had been waiting for something exactly like this to happen. In Medical Bay, Dr. Virex was having the worst day of her professional career. She'd assembled a full surgical team, pulled every specialist available, and they were all staring at the scans of Krevix's face with the kind of fascinated horror that medical professionals get when confronted with new and interesting ways biology could fail. The dermal plating is shattered in 17 places, the cranial specialist said, highlighting sections on the display. The internal structure has multiple fracture lines. There's significant swelling in the surrounding tissue. And look at this, he zoomed in on a particular section, you can see where. The impact force actually transferred through the plating into the bone equivalent underneath. That's not supposed to be possible with Vexorian physiology. How much force would this require? Dr. Virex asked. The specialist ran calculations, checked them twice, then checked them again because the numbers couldn't possibly be right. Approximately 400 pounds of impact force, concentrated area. That's insane. She's a human. They're not that strong. They are actually. The medical AI chimed in, because it had better access to the database. Human striking force from trained combatants averages between 280 and 500 pounds per square inch, depending on technique and body mass. Cadet Chen is certified in multiple combat systems. This is within expected parameters. Every organic being in the room turned to stare at the AI interface. Expected parameters? Dr. Virex repeated. Yes. Humans evolved as persistence predators with significant capability for burst violence. Their musculature is optimized for both endurance and explosive force generation. The Confederation assessment files have extensive documentation on human combat capabilities. Does anyone actually read the assessment files? One of the technicians asked. The room was silent. We need to reconstruct this, Dr. Virex said finally, turning back to the scans. Full facial reconstruction, structural reinforcement, probably looking at 3 separate surgeries minimum. Start prepping. While they worked, Ambassador Val Thorin was receiving the news. He'd been in a diplomatic meeting when the emergency notification came through. His son was in surgery. Catastrophic facial trauma. Cause, altercation with human cadet. The ambassador had immediately made his apologies, cleared his schedule, and headed for the academy at best speed, already composing the complaint he'd file, the sanctions he'd demand, the way he'd use this to prove that humans were dangerous and unsuited for integration. Then he'd arrived at the academy and been shown the security footage. All of it. The weeks of harassment. The escalating provocations. The cafeteria incident from 4 different angles. Crystal clear, with audio. His son deliberately blocking the human. His son making the first physical contact. The human's response, which had taken approximately 0.7 seconds from decision to execution. The ambassador had watched the footage 3 times. Then asked to see it again with the combat analysis overlay, which broke down the punch into its component movements and highlighted the efficiency of it. Then he'd asked to see Krevix's disciplinary file, which someone helpfully pulled up, all 17 prior incidents detailed in careful bureaucratic language. He'd sat there for approximately 10 minutes, saying nothing, while Academy administration waited nervously. Finally, he'd stood up. My son will be withdrawn from the Academy when medically cleared. We will be covering all medical expenses. No complaints will be filed. The Academy's commandant had blinked. Ambassador, while we appreciate, my son assaulted a fellow cadet after weeks of harassment. The human showed restraint. I saw the footage. She gave him 3 chances to move, then gave warning before responding to physical aggression. This is a failure of my son's judgment, and my own failure as a parent. We will handle it internally. He'd left after that, heading to Medical Bay to wait outside surgery, looking like a man who'd just had several illusions shattered along with his son's face. The Academy administration, meanwhile, had their own crisis meeting. The footage had spread, naturally. Students had copies. Within hours it would be on every major network. They needed to get ahead of this, control the narrative, figure out how to handle what could become a massive incident. Captain Thrace, the commandant, pulled up Chen's file. She's been here 8 months. Perfect record. High marks in every category. No prior incidents. Multiple commendations. Doesn't matter. One of the administrators said. She put another cadet in surgery. The optics are that a cadet with 17 disciplinary incidents, who should have been expelled 6 incidents ago, finally faced consequences for putting his hands on someone who could hit back. Show me one regulation she violated. They went through it, frame by frame. Chen had attempted to disengage 3 times. She'd given verbal warning. She'd been physically contacted first. When she'd responded, she'd used a single strike, hadn't followed up when Krevix went down, hadn't shown excessive force beyond what was necessary to end the immediate threat. It's textbook self-defense, the legal advisor said finally. She actually showed more restraint than the law requires. She could have kept hitting him and still been within legal boundaries for responding to physical assault. So what do we do? Another administrator asked. We clear her officially, we apologize for the institutional failure that let it get this far, and we implement new protocols about physical contact with Class 9 worlders. Also, we probably review how Val Thorin's previous complaints kept disappearing. They spent another hour hammering out details, drafting statements, preparing for media response. Then they called Chen in. She'd been waiting in an administrative holding room for about 3 hours by that point, had gone through formal statement process, and was mostly just bored. When she was escorted to the commandant's office, she maintained that same unreadable calm that apparently made everyone else nervous. Captain Thrace gestured to a chair. Sit, cadet. Chen Saturday waited. You're not being charged with anything, Thrace said. Security footage shows clear self-defense. Cadet Val Thorin initiated physical contact after sustained harassment. You responded appropriately. Yes, sir. That said, we need to discuss something. Thrace leaned forward. Did you know that punch would do that much damage? Chen was quiet for a moment. I understood the physics involved. Yes, sir. You could have pulled it. Sir, he'd been harassing me for 6 weeks. He outweighs me by 80 pounds and has natural armor plating. I gave him multiple opportunities to disengage. When he made physical contact, I responded with appropriate force to ensure the threat was neutralized. If I'd pulled it, he might not have taken the lesson seriously. Thrace blinked, then laughed, short and sharp. Fair point. He pulled up something on his display. You're cleared to return to normal duties. No marks on your record. The Academy is issuing a formal apology for the failures in handling prior incidents. We're also implementing new protocols regarding physical contact with Deathworlder cadets. Is that necessary, sir? Apparently yes, because people seem to need it spelled out. Don't grab humans, don't grab Karothians, don't grab anyone from any planet where the gravity would crush your ancestors into paste. Seems simple, but here we are. He stood, and Chen followed. You're dismissed, cadet. Try not to hospitalize anyone else. No promises, sir. Chen left, and Thrace looked at his staff. I like her. Word spread through the academy faster than light traveled. By evening meal, every cadet knew the official outcome. Chen was cleared. Krevix was being withdrawn. New protocols were being implemented. The footage was being used in an emergency addition to orientation programming as a teaching example of what not to do. The reaction was mixed. Some cadets thought Chen should have been punished regardless. Most thought the outcome was fair. The humans were just glad it was over and that Chen hadn't gotten screwed by politics. Other Deathworlder cadets were privately satisfied that someone had finally demonstrated what they'd all been carefully not demonstrating for cycles. Chen herself went back to her routine like nothing had happened. Same training schedule, same meal schedule, same study groups. The difference was that now, other cadets gave her even more space. Not out of fear, exactly. More like respect mixed with healthy self-preservation instinct. The few who did approach her found she was exactly as pleasant and professional as she'd always been. Just, with the implied caveat that grabbing her was a terrible idea. The surgical reconstruction of Krevix's face took 3 operations over the course of 10 days. They did good work, the medical team. His facial structure would never be quite the same, would always have slight asymmetry if you knew what to look for, but functionally he'd be fine. Psychologically, that was going to take longer. He'd woken up after the first surgery and asked what happened. They'd told him. He'd been quiet for a long time, then asked to see the footage. They'd showed him. He'd watched himself being an arrogant fool. Watched the moment he'd pushed her, watched the punch that had rewritten his face geometry. I didn't think she could, he'd started, then stopped. I didn't think. No, doctor. Virex had agreed. You didn't. 6 months later, Kravix was stationed at a remote training facility on the other end of Confederation space. Far from Earth. Far from humans. Far from anyone who might remind him of his moment of spectacular stupidity. He'd learned things from the experience. Humility, mostly. Also respect, and a healthy appreciation for reading assessment files before making assumptions. Chen graduated with honors, commissioned as a junior officer, and was assigned to a mixed-species vessel where her competence and complete lack of drama made her popular with the crew. She never talked about the incident unless directly asked, and even then kept it brief. It wasn't something she was proud of. It was just something that had happened because someone hadn't listened to multiple warnings. The punch became legend, required viewing for new cadets at Zenith Academy and a dozen other institutions. A teaching example. A cautionary tale. The moment became shorthand. Don't be Valthorin. Everyone knew what it meant. What made it all so beautifully ironic was that the Confederation had spent 40 cycles carefully integrating humans, taking precautions, implementing protocols, all because they were terrified of these Deathworld primates, with their overbuilt bodies and their concerning history of violence. They treated humans like loaded weapons, which was fair enough. What they'd failed to understand was that humans had spent thousands of years developing societies specifically to keep those weapons holstered. Humans weren't dangerous because they could hit hard. Plenty of species could hit hard. Humans were dangerous because they could hit that hard and usually chose not to. They could kill with their bare hands and instead shook yours gently in greeting. They could survive conditions that would flatten other species and used that endurance to help people. They were violence on a leash, civilization holding back chaos, and the truly terrifying thing was that they'd built that civilization themselves, on a planet that had never once been gentle with them. The Confederation had made all these rules about how to handle humans, when to be cautious, what protocols to follow. What they should have done was teach people the same lesson humans learned in childhood, the same lesson every functional society eventually figured out. Keep your hands to yourself. Respect boundaries. Listen when people set limits. Simple stuff, really. Kindergarten material. But apparently, even in a civilization that had mastered faster than light travel and quantum computing, that lesson still needed to be learned the hard way sometimes. Usually by someone who thought they were too important for basic courtesy, who assumed size meant strength and strength meant dominance, who forgot that on a long enough timeline, everyone meets someone who can humble them. Kravix Valthorin had met his someone in a cafeteria at Zenith Academy, and she'd been 5'5", 122 pounds, and completely done with his nonsense. The surgeons had put his face back together with impressive skill, but there were some lessons that left scars you couldn't see. And somewhere in Confederation space, a compact woman from Earth was doing her job, being professional, following regulations, and carrying around the knowledge that if she ever really needed to, she could reorganize someone's facial structure in under a second, but she probably wouldn't need to. Because word had gotten around, the galaxy was learning. Humans were polite. Humans were reasonable. Humans were friendly and cooperative, and generally delightful additions to galactic civilization. Right up until you put your hands on them. Then you found out what evolution on a Class 9 Deathworld actually meant, and the lesson came with medical bills and a lifetime of caution around anyone from that oversized gravity well full of friendly monsters. The Confederation had wanted to know what humans were capable of. Now they knew, and they'd learned it the same way Kravix had. One punch at a time.